The heavy silver platter dented the mahogany paneling with a deafening crack, narrowly missing the head of a terrified young footman before clattering to the marble floor. Shards of fine bone china were already scattered like white bones across the rug, victims of 9-year-old Rocco DeLuca, who was currently using a vintage silk tapestry as target practice for his slingshot. His face was a mask of cold, inherited arrogance as he took aim at a crystal chandelier, ignoring the pleas of the household staff. In the grand foyer, the roar of a dirt bike engine echoed off the vaulted ceilings. 14-year-old Luca was revving the machine, his tires leaving charred black streaks across the pristine tiles while he laughed at the chaos. Meanwhile, the eldest, 17-year-old Enzo, leaned against a gilded column. He wasn't participating in the destruction. Instead, he held a gold-plated smartphone, filming the panic of the servants with a bored, predatory smile. He narrated the scene for a private audience of underworld elites, mocking the peasantry, who dared to try and govern his father's house. This was the inferno Morel Vance walked into on her first morning at the DeLuca estate. She didn't stop dead in her tracks or gasp in horror. Instead, she adjusted the cuffs of her neat black and white uniform and stepped over a jagged piece of porcelain with the grace of a cat. A senior maid, Isabella, came stumbling from the kitchen wing, her apron stained with red wine and her eyes wide with a primal sort of fear. She nearly collapsed into Morel, grabbing her shoulders with trembling hands. "Get out of here!" Isabella hissed, her voice cracking with desperation. "They aren't boys, they are monsters born of the Dawn's own shadow. No salary is worth your life. Even the Dawn's deadliest soldiers won't step foot in this wing. Run before they set their sights on you." As if on cue, a heavy glass tumbler filled with dark Chianti sailed through the air, shattering against the wall behind Isabella and soaking her back in a stain that looked hauntingly like blood. Rocco's shrill, mocking laughter cut through the engine noise. "And that's 60, Enzo announced to his camera, his voice dripping with venomous amusement as he panned the lens toward the fleeing woman's back. 60 servants in 18 months. Most don't survive the first hour. Let's see if this new little lamb has a backbone, or if she'll be the 61st to crawl out of here in tears." He turned the lens toward Morel. For the first time, the three princes of the DeLuca Empire actually looked at the woman standing in their territory. Morel didn't flinch. She didn't look at the mess. She looked directly into Enzo's eyes, her expression as calm and unreadable as the deep Mediterranean Sea, her posture projecting an authority that not even the Mafia Don himself had been able to instill in his own sons. Morel's gaze remained fixed on Enzo as she reached into the pocket of her apron, pulling out a crisp, white linen handkerchief. Without breaking eye contact, she leaned down and wiped a small stray drop of Chianti from her polished shoe. The room fell into an expectant, heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock and the low, idling hum of Luca's dirt bike. Rocco, frustrated by the lack of a reaction, notched another stone into his slingshot. "Did you hear the video, Maid?" he sneered, his voice high but sharp. "You're just a number. 61. Why don't you start crying now and save us all some time?" He released the tension, and the stone whistled through the air, aimed directly at the espresso cup Morel had just picked up from a side table. With a movement so fluid it seemed practiced, Morel tilted the saucer. The stone struck the porcelain edge with a sharp metallic clack and ricocheted harmlessly into a velvet curtain. She didn't jump. She didn't even blink. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark Italian roast, her eyes never leaving the boys. "Red wine is a difficult stain to remove from Carrara marble," Morel said, her voice low and melodic, yet carrying a vibration of steel that cut through the boys' bravado. "And blood, I've found, is even harder. You three play at being men of the DeLuca name, but you move like clumsy toddlers breaking their father's toys because they are bored. Luca revved his engine again, a challenge, but Morel simply gestured to the two male staff members, Victor and Dominic, who were still trembling on the floor. "Gentlemen, stand up. Take your buckets and leave. From this moment on, no one cleans this wing but the people who live in it." The boys froze. Enzo lowered his phone, his smirk faltering as he realized she wasn't following the script of the 59 women before her. "You don't give orders here," Enzo hissed, stepping toward her. Morel set her cup down with a definitive click. "I don't give orders to servants, Enzo. I give lessons to children. And your first lesson is this: until this floor is as spotless as it was at dawn, the kitchen is a fortress you cannot enter. No dinner, no snacks, no exceptions. If you want to live like animals, you can begin by starving like them." The silence that followed Morel's declaration was heavy, thick with the scent of spilled wine and the dying hum of Luca's motorcycle. Enzo stepped closer, his jaw tight, trying to reclaim the air of authority that usually sent the staff scurrying into the shadows. "You think you can starve us in our own house?" he challenged, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low-register growl. "My father owns every brick of this estate. One word from me, and you're buried in the garden, not just fired." Morel didn't flinch. She simply turned her back on him, a gesture of pure, calculated disrespect, and walked toward the massive oak doors of the kitchen. With a heavy iron key she had secured from the fleeing Isabella, she turned the lock. The click echoed like a gunshot through the marble foyer. "Ownership is a legal concept, Enzo," she said over her shoulder. "But the stomach is a biological one. Your father may own the bricks, but I hold the keys to the pantry." By noon, the bravado began to fray. Luca, used to having high-protein meals prepared on demand to fuel his adrenaline-fueled hobbies, stormed the kitchen only to find the handles chained. He kicked the door, the boom echoing through the halls, but Morel remained seated in the dining hall, calmly reading a book. When Rocco tried to sneak into the servants' quarters to demand a sandwich from Victor, he found the boy terrified but firm. Morel had told the staff that anyone who fed the brothers would be held responsible for their next tantrum. No one was willing to risk her wrath to appease a DeLuca. As the sun began to dip, casting long, bloody shadows across the estate, the boys gathered in the hallway. Their stomachs were beginning to growl, a sensation entirely foreign to the princes of the underworld. They were used to getting what they wanted through fear, but Morel wasn't afraid. She was the first person to treat them not as heirs to a throne, but as children who hadn't earned their keep. The hunger was sharp, but the realization that their names meant nothing to this woman was sharper. They weren't just starving for food; for the first time in their lives, they were starving for a control they no longer possessed. The heavy, reinforced front doors of the DeLuca estate swung open at midnight, admitting a cold draft and the rhythmic click of polished Oxfords against the marble. Vittorio DeLuca entered his home like a king returning to a conquered territory, his black overcoat draped over his shoulders. He stopped, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene. The foyer was still a battlefield of dried wine and porcelain shards. In the center of the wreckage, illuminated by a single dim lamp, sat Morel. She was perfectly composed, her hands folded over a ledger. "I paid for a staff of 20 so that I never have to see a mess, let alone walk through one." Vittorio's voice was like grinding gravel, low and dangerous. He gestured to the filth. "Why is my home in this state, and where are my sons?" Morel stood slowly, her shadow stretching long across the broken floor. "Your sons are in their rooms, Mr. DeLuca. And the mess remains because the hands that made it have not yet seen fit to clean it. I have dismissed the cleaning crew for the night." Vittorio stepped into her personal space, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain clinging to him. He was a man who moved mountains with a whisper, yet this girl didn't even lower her gaze. You were hired to manage the house, not to play philosopher. My sons do not clean. They are DeLucas. They are starving DeLucas, Morel countered, her voice unwavering. I have locked the kitchens. They haven't eaten since I arrived, and they won't until this floor is returned to its original state. You haven't raised heirs, Vittorio. You've raised vandals who think their name exempts them from the basic laws of consequence. Vittorio's eyes flashed with a lethal spark. He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat, not to strike, but to intimidate, to remind her who owned the air she breathed. You dare starve my blood under my own roof? I could have you erased for less. Then erase me, Morel whispered, leaning into his space, her eyes defiant. But then you'll be on your 61st failure, and your sons will continue to be the weakest link in your empire. You're not angry that I'm starving them. You're angry because I'm doing the one thing you're too afraid to do, being a parent. For a long, breathless moment, the Don of the DeLuca family stared at the maid. The tension was a living thing, vibrating between them until, finally, Vittorio stepped back, a shadow of something like respect flickering in his cold, dark eyes. The morning of the second day arrived with a heavy, restless energy. Morel knew that the princes wouldn't surrender to a growling stomach without a fight. They were the sons of a man who dealt in contraband, and they had inherited his instinct for the black market. While the boys slept in late, exhausted by their first night of true hunger, Morel moved through the upper floors with the clinical precision of a customs agent. She began in Rocco's room. Behind a row of rare, hand-painted lead soldiers, she found a hollowed-out book filled not with stories, but with high-end Belgian chocolates and salted caramels. She emptied them into her apron without a word. In Luca's suite, she bypassed the dirt bike gear and went straight to the gym bag tucked in the back of his walk-in closet. Beneath a false bottom, she unearthed a hoard of protein bars and dried jerky, fuel meant for his clandestine races, now confiscated. The final stop was Enzo's quarters. The eldest DeLuca watched from his bed, his eyes bleary but burning with resentment as Morel pulled a loose floorboard from beneath his designer rug. She pulled out a stash of imported truffles and expensive crackers, the kind of luxury snacks only a boy with an unlimited allowance could procure. That's theft, Enzo spat, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. You're stealing from us. I am clearing the field, Enzo, Morel replied, standing tall as she clutched the hoard of treasure in her arms. A soldier doesn't get to eat while his barracks are in shambles. These were your safety nets. You thought you could wait me out by feasting in the dark while the rest of the house suffered your mess. She walked to the balcony, where the three boys could see her from their respective rooms. Below, in the courtyard, a large industrial bin sat waiting. With a single, fluid motion, Morel dumped the hundreds of dollars worth of gourmet snacks into the trash. The safety nets are gone, she announced, her voice carrying through the morning air. The only path to a meal is through the foyer. Pick up a broom, or continue to admire your treasure as it rots in the sun. The choice is yours, but the clock is ticking. Vittorio found Morel in the glass-walled conservatory, where the moonlight silvered the exotic plants and cast long, skeletal shadows across the stone floor. He had shed his blazer and unbuttoned his collar, looking less like a king and more like a man haunted by his own borders. He watched her for a moment. Her stillness was a weapon he hadn't yet learned to disarm. The boys are restless, Vittorio said, his voice echoing in the quiet space. Enzo is pacing like a caged wolf, and Rocco is crying in his sleep. You've stripped them of their dignity, Morel. In my world, once you lose your dignity, you lose your life. Morel didn't turn around. She remained looking out at the dark Italian cypress trees. You confuse dignity with entitlement, Vittorio. Dignity is earned through character. Your sons have none because they have never been required to be anything other than a reflection of your power. They aren't restless because they're DeLucas, they're restless because they're terrified that for the first time, their name can't buy them a full stomach. Vittorio stepped closer, his presence a heavy weight. And what of their mother? Do you think your little lessons can erase the void she left? They act out because they are broken. They act out because you let them, Morel countered, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were sharp, reflecting the lunar light. You use their mother's absence as an excuse for your own. You provide them with gold and steel, but you refuse to provide them with a father. You're so busy protecting your empire from the families in Naples that you've let your own house rot from the inside. You aren't raising soldiers, Vittorio. You're raising casualties. Vittorio's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. For a second, the air crackled with the possibility of his legendary temper, but then he let out a long, weary breath. The mask of the dawn slipped, revealing a glimpse of the grieving man beneath. I don't know how to be what they need, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Start by letting them see you stand behind me, Morel said softly, stepping into his space. Don't save them from this hunger. Let them feel it. It's the only thing that will make them appreciate the hands that finally feed them. The sun rose on the third day, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the dried wine stains and porcelain dust that still coated the grand foyer. The silence of the house was no longer one of peace, but of a grinding, physical exhaustion. Morel sat at the small table near the base of the stairs, a single glass of water in front of her, watching as the three brothers descended. They looked nothing like the princes of the underworld, who had greeted her 48 hours ago. Their hair was unkempt, their expensive silk shirts were wrinkled, and their movements were slow, weighted down by the hollow ache in their midsections. It was Enzo who moved first. He didn't look at Morel, but he walked to the utility closet and pulled out a heavy industrial bucket. The sound of water splashing into the plastic echoed through the hollow house like a thunderclap. Luca followed, grabbing a stiff bristled brush, his face a mask of simmering resentment that was slowly being drowned out by necessity. Little Rocco, the most fragile of the three, picked up a sponge with trembling hands, his eyes watering not from a tantrum, but from the sheer indignity of his first real task. Morel watched in silence as the heirs to the De Luca fortune dropped to their knees. At first, they were clumsy, spreading the grime rather than lifting it. Luca cursed under his breath, his knuckles turning white as he scrubbed at a particularly stubborn patch of red wine. Enzo worked with a grim, focused intensity, his phone, once a weapon for mockery, discarded and forgotten on a hallway bench. The corners, Morel said softly, her voice the only sound above the rhythmic scratching of brushes. The world sees the center of the room, but a person of character ensures the edges are clean too. They worked for 4 hours. As they scrubbed, something shifted in the atmosphere. The hostility that usually bound them together in destruction began to transform into a quiet, shared labor. They passed the soap and the fresh water back and forth without being asked. They weren't fighting the staff or their father anymore, they were fighting the mess they had made of their own lives. By the time the marble began to gleam under the afternoon sun, the boys were drenched in sweat and gray water, their hands raw, but for the first time, they looked at the house they lived in and actually saw it. The foyer was finally silent, the marble floors gleaming like a polished mirror under the midday sun. The boys sat on the bottom step, their breathing heavy, their pride stripped away along with the dirt they had spent hours scrubbing. Morel walked toward them, her footsteps echoing in the vast space, carrying a tray with 3 simple glasses of cool water and a plate of sliced bread. It wasn't a feast, but to the starving brothers, it looked like a miracle. Just as Rocco reached for a glass, his elbow caught the edge of a small, ornate pedestal. A heavy, hand-carved soapstone figurine, an antique Vittorio had brought back from a dangerous deal in Sicily, wobbled and plummeted. The crash was sharp. The figurine didn't just break, it pulverized into a dozen jagged pieces. The silence that followed was suffocating. Luca and Enzo flinched, pulling back as if expecting a blow. Little Rocco turned ghost-white, his eyes filling with a sudden, primal terror. He didn't look like a Mafia prince anymore, he looked like a terrified child waiting for the hand of a vengeful father. He scrambled to his knees, his hands hovering over the shards. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, I'll fix it. I'll scrub the floor again. Don't tell him. Don't let him see." Morel looked at the broken stone, then at the boy cowering on the floor. In the DeLuca world, an accident was treated as a failure, and failure was met with cold, hard discipline. She saw in Rocco's eyes the scars of 1,000 moments where he had been taught that his value was tied to his perfection and his name. Slowly, Morel knelt in the dust beside him. She didn't reach for a switch, and she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she reached out and gently took Rocco's small, shaking hands in hers, pulling them away from the sharp edges. "It is only stone, Rocco," she said softly, her voice a calm anchor in his storm of panic. "Stone can be replaced. A child's spirit cannot." She began to pick up the pieces herself, motioning for the older brothers to help. "In this house, we clean our messes, but we do not fear them. An accident is not a sin." Rocco looked at her, a single tear finally escaping and trekking through the dust on his cheek. For the first time, he didn't see a jailer. He saw someone who was willing to shield him from the very shadow he had been born into. The wall of defiance that had protected the boys for years didn't just crack, it began to crumble. News of the Great Starvation at the DeLuca estate spread through the Neapolitan underworld like a fever. It was a breach of the old world order. Servants were meant to be invisible instruments of comfort, not architects of discipline. One evening, while the boys sat at the dining table eating a simple, hard-earned meal of pasta pomodoro, the heavy front doors were thrown open. A group of Vittorio's high-ranking captains, men like Alessandro and Cedric, strode into the foyer, their faces dark with disapproval. They represented the commission, the silent weight of tradition that kept the DeLuca name feared. "Vittorio," Alessandro's voice boomed, his eyes scanning the gleaming floors and the boys who sat with straight backs instead of running wild. "We hear you have allowed a common girl to humiliate your heirs. This is not the way of our people. If you cannot control your own house, how can the families trust you to control the docks?" Vittorio stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy signet ring on his finger, but before he could speak, Morel stepped out from the shadows of the gallery. She did not look like a common girl, she looked like a sovereign who had reclaimed a lost kingdom. She walked past the armed men, her presence so cold and commanding that even Cedric, a man who had survived a dozen turf wars, took a half-step back. "Control is not found in a gun or a threat, gentlemen," Morel said, her voice echoing with a clarity that silenced the room. "It is found in respect. You see boys who have been humiliated, but I see men who finally understand the weight of the name they carry. If you find discipline to be a sign of weakness, then your empire is already built on sand." She turned to the boys, who had stood up in unison, not out of fear, but out of a new, fierce loyalty to the woman who had finally seen them. They didn't look to the captains for approval, they looked to her. "The underworld thrives on chaos," Morel continued, staring directly into Alessandro's eyes. But a home is built on order. If you have business with the Don, take it to his study. But in this house, the rules are mine. And I do not remember inviting you to dinner. Vittorio watched her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. For the first time, he wasn't just a Don protecting a legacy, he was a man witnessing the birth of a new one. The captains grumbled, but under Morel's unflinching gaze and Vittorio's silent endorsement, they realized the power dynamic had shifted forever. The Maid had not just tamed the sons, she had conquered the culture of the De Luca bloodline itself. The golden sun of the Sicilian coast dipped toward the Mediterranean, painting the sky in the same deep oranges and soft violets that had once characterized the De Luca family's most turbulent nights. But today, the heavy iron gates of the estate stood open, not as a defensive measure, but as a welcome. The scent of blooming orange blossoms and salt air replaced the smell of gunpowder and old tobacco. Vittorio De Luca stood at the altar, looking out over the hundreds of guests, heads of families, soldiers, and civilians alike. He wore his power differently now, it was no longer a shield of ice, but a mantle of quiet, rooted strength. By his side, his 3 sons stood as his groomsmen. Enzo, now 19, carried himself with a refined authority, his phone tucked away, his eyes scanning the crowd with a protective watchfulness that was genuine, not performed. Luca stood tall and disciplined, the restless energy of his youth channeled into a focused, calm presence. And young Rocco, no longer the boy who broke things to be seen, clutched the wedding rings with a proud, steady hand. When the music shifted to a soft, traditional string arrangement, the crowd fell silent. Morel appeared at the end of the aisle. She wore a gown of ivory lace that clung to her with the same effortless elegance she had brought to her housemaid's uniform. She didn't walk like a common girl entering a high society life, she walked like a woman who had already conquered it. As she reached the altar, Vittorio took her hand, his fingers grazing the skin of the woman who had dared to starve his sons and ended up saving his soul. "I was a man who owned everything and possessed nothing," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion the underworld rarely witnessed. "You taught us that a house is just stone, but a family is a choice." Morel looked at the 3 boys, who smiled at her with a warmth that had once seemed impossible. "The legacy of the De Lucas used to be fear," she replied softly. "Today, we start a legacy of loyalty." Under the watchful eyes of Sicily, the Mafia Don and the Maid who tamed his house exchanged vows. As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the 3 brothers were the first to applaud. They weren't just the sons of a Don anymore, they were the heart of a home, built on the firm foundation of the woman who had loved them enough to say no. As the sun sets over the Sicilian coast and the bells of the chapel fade into the evening air, we are left with a family that was once broken beyond repair, now bound by a loyalty that not even the strongest Mafia commission could dismantle. It's a transformation that seems almost impossible, from a household of glass-shattering rage to a home of quiet respect. But this story raises a question that has sparked debates in households everywhere. Morel Vance didn't use wealth, or status, or even her employer's fearsome reputation to tame the De Luca brothers. She used a method that many would call extreme. She used the silence of an empty kitchen and the weight of a 3-day fast to break a cycle of entitlement. She believed that before you can teach a child how to lead, you must first teach them the value of the hands that serve. She gambled everything, her job, and perhaps even her safety, on the idea that hunger for food would eventually lead to a hunger for character. "Now, I want to turn the camera on you." Was Morel a visionary who did what no one else had the courage to do, or did she cross a line that should never be crossed? In a world where these boys were already surrounded by violence and coldness, was tough love the only language they would understand, or was it too much? If you were standing in that marble foyer, watching the 60th Maid flee in tears, what would you have done? Would you have stayed and fought for these demon children, or would you have walked away like the dozens before you? And to the parents watching, have you ever had to use a lesson of consequence to reach a child who seemed unreachable? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts on Morel's rule of the Denver. Was she a hero for saving a family, or was her method too harsh? We want to hear your stories of transformation and the unconventional ways love sometimes has to show its face. If this journey of the DeLuca family moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes that no one is truly beyond saving. Thank you for watching until the very end. Remember, sometimes the person who challenges us the most is the one who loves us the best. Until next time.